Okay, good. So it worked. Sorry for the delay.
You're good to go.
Okay, so thanks everyone. I'm excited to be here today, and I am so happy to share this information with you. I am going to talk a little bit about the California's marine protected areas, but I'm mostly going to focus in on the Sonoma MPA Collaborative, and then also give you a short presentation on the Bodega Marine Reserve and Laboratory. And I am the Reserve Director for Bodega Marine Reserve. And of course, you probably all know that the reserve is home to the Bodega Marine Laboratory. So I am in charge of the reserve, not the full laboratory. We partner very closely with the laboratory because we are co-located on this amazing site on Bodega Head. I also serve as co-chair for the Sonoma Marine Protected Areas Collaborative, along with Justin and Hollis. And previously it was Michelle Luna. So I'm wearing a few different hats today. And so the first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk more about the MPAs and the Sonoma Collaborative, and then I'll switch into talking about the reserve and laboratory. So I'll give you just a 20-second version of a little bit of my background. So I've been the reserve director for BMR for I'm in my 13th year now, I think, but I've also was a graduate student through UC Davis and did all of my dissertation research out in Bodega Bay. I actually worked in the Rocky Intertidal for some of my projects, and then also out in the harbor in the eelgrass beds. So that's my scientific training and background. So I've been out in the area for a long time, and clearly have grown to love it very much. So I'm happy to share some of this information with you today. So the California's MPAs were designated when, or they were instituted when the Marine Life Protection Act was passed in 1999. And that was an intensive stakeholder-led process. It led to the establishment of 124 marine protected areas across the coast of California, and you can see all of the dots there. As Hollis mentioned earlier this morning, there are different designations of MPAs. So there, I laid out the 5 types there. There are the state marine reserves, which are absolutely no take of biological resources. There are state marine conservation areas, which have limited or no take, depending on which one you're talking about. There's also state marine parks with limited take, state marine recreational management areas with limited or no take, and then special closures, which are no entry. So this network, as you can see, is distributed across the state of California, and we would be here for hours if I went into all of the different criteria that went into the establishment of where they would be. Suffice it to say that it was a combination of ecological and biological factors, but also a lot of social and cultural and economic factors. So the Marine Life Protected Act was required all of those things. So all of the sites were implemented in 2012, and we're coming up on our 10-year monitoring of those. And Fish and Wildlife has a lot of information on the upcoming monitoring reports from the functioning of all of these MPAs. So I wanted to point out, though, that these protections through the marine protected areas are focused on biological resources. So this is in contrast to other areas and other designations that protect different resources and also restrict other activities. For example, the National Marine Sanctuaries, which I'll show in a few minutes. And the fact that we have 124 of these sites along the coast of California is a lot. And this, obviously, once they're designated, that means that the Department of Fish and Wildlife has a lot of management to do across these 124 sites. So because of that mandate that Fish and Wildlife has to manage all of these sites, and the reality that they were not in a position to jump in and do that to the full hilt, there were some people starting down in Southern California, and particularly Calla Allison, I want to give a shout out to today. She's the collaborative network director, but she was involved with the birth of the Marine Protected Areas Collaborative. She was really the person who drove it. And I think she had an amazing vision for this. And she's really been a driver of this collaborative network, and continues to do be an excellent director of the network. So she really looked at how difficult it was going to be for Fish and Wildlife to do all of the management of these areas. So she took an example from Orange County. We can consider that as the first collaborative that was put together. And that collaborative brought together local experts to manage the marine protected area that they had down there, the areas that they have down there in Orange County. And so she was seeing how successful that local effort was to sort of help support the marine protected areas and encourage compliance and do education around it. So she wanted to replicate that across the state. She was able to get some key support early on from the Natural Resources Agency and Fish and Wildlife, and then also funding from the Resource Legacy Fund that has provided a lot of financial support for collaborative efforts. And that allowed her to establish collaboratives in the southern counties like San Diego, Santa Barbara, and San Mateo, starting in 2012. And then when those were successful, she was able to build on that success and replicate it all up and down the coast of California. So in 2013 was the year that the Sonoma County Collaborative was formed. And that's when Michelle, Luna, and I came in as co-chairs to help that effort. So you can see here's the map of California of the coastal areas. We have 14 collaboratives across the state. That includes over 600 members, and it's growing. It has over 385 represented organizations now. And the mission is really to empower the coastal communities to advance marine protected areas management and encourage ocean stewardship. So because California is a big state, and we all know that Northern California is very different than Central and Southern California, these collaboratives were set up really to provide for those local differences and the diversity of what we have along our coastal areas in California, and to involve the different community members and nonprofits and NGOs and agencies and others that are involved in coastal management along our state. So this collaborative network is really something unique. One of the most unique aspects of it is that it's a bottom-up local effort, meeting the agencies from the top-down direction. We have actually been recognized. The collaborative network has been recognized by the state as being an important part of the MPA management. And the state doesn't dictate the structure of the collaboratives. The collaboratives develop that themselves, county by county. And this really has led to more buy-in and resource sharing from the local organizations. It also means that the collaboratives are different across the state. And it was sort of a nice recognition that occurred a few years ago now, that the role of the collaboratives in helping to manage California's marine protected areas was formally recognized in the MPA partnership plan. And if you really want some riveting reading, you can read that on the Fish and Wildlife website. But it's a good document that sets up our role in helping to manage and is recognized by the state. So the collaboratives are often called upon for their input by the state agencies. And the collaborative network really provides us with a good venue, a communication pathway from our local groups and community members to send information into Fish and Wildlife. And, if things aren't working or if we need to update things, it's a really good vehicle for us getting a voice into Fish and Wildlife. So, there's a lot of variety in what the collaboratives do along the coast. Most of them are focused on things like helping to support MPA compliance and education. And of course, we don't have jurisdiction to do any enforcement. So the helping to educate and really promote compliance that way has become one of the main objectives of the collaboratives. So there's been a lot of, the collaboratives have been very productive and produced a lot of interesting resources. There's an excellent website to go and dig into some of these resources, but I just want to highlight the different forms that we have. So the different collaboratives have produced videos, brochures, and informational booklets. They've done a lot of different educational resources and training materials. There's a lot of information for teachers for building their curriculum around MPAs and ocean issues. There's a lot of posters and signs that have been developed by the collaboratives. There's also some online activities and apps for your phone that have been produced by the collaboratives. And the other thing is that we generally, each collaborative has held a compliance forum. We've held a couple now in Bodega for the Sonoma Collaborative. And that really brings together a lot of the enforcement folks, the rangers and the sheriffs and other people, to talk about what are the issues happening in our local areas and what spots we need more help with, or issues that they have that they want to share with us so that we can potentially help with that. And then we have produced reports from those compliance forums. So all of those are available on the MPA Collaborative Network website if you're interested in those. And I've listed particularly for the projects, I've listed the website address there if anybody's interested. So I think Hollis also talked about the MPAs particular to Sonoma County this morning. I won't go through these again, but it's good for you to see the map there. And we have 10 MPAs in Sonoma County. And of course, we also want to make note that we have the newly expanded Greater Fairlands National Marine Sanctuary covers our Sonoma County coast. And I thought it was an interesting tidbit to share that data collected by the CODAR instrument that I'll show later, that's located on the Bodega Marine Reserve and run by the laboratory. It tracks sea surface currents, both the direction and the velocity of sea surface currents. And data from that system was actually used by a faculty member from Bodega Marine Laboratory, Suzanne Williams, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But she used the data from that system to actually argue for the expansion of that Greater Fairlands National Marine Sanctuary. So that's one of the many applied uses of some of the data that's being collected on our site. So I've already talked about our co-chairs. It's worth noting that when we think about the Sonoma Collaborative, we've often been asked to sort of highlight the particular things that makes our Sonoma Collaborative unique. And I think that probably most of you are very well familiar with some of these highlights, but I thought I'd share them today as things that we think about in our collaborative and things that play into the projects that we take on in our collaborative. Of course, we have a very highly visited coast, and this is an old statistic. I bet it's gone way up from the pandemic situation, but we have over 4 million visitors that come to the Sonoma Coast annually. We have very highly visited state parks. We have a commercial fishing fleet based in Bodega Bay. We also have the University of California Bodega Marine Reserve and Laboratory. We have participation by Native American tribes. We also have the Greater Fairlands National Marine Sanctuary along our coast, the Fort Ross Historical Site, U.S. Coast Guard station, and also, of course, the agricultural, the ranching and wine industry along our coast that influences all of our coastal activities. Our membership in the collaborative is pretty extensive. We have a good representation from a lot of different groups. We are very pleased that we have a commercial fisherman who has joined our ranks, Dick Ogg. He's always a good resource for us. So if any of you want any more information about the collaborative meetings, we usually have a general meeting once or twice a year, and then we have a listserv that also tells you news about what's going on and if there are any active projects, what's happening with the project. So feel free to contact me if you'd want to get added to that list. So the projects that the Sonoma Marine Protected Areas Collaborative has focused on is a lot of public education. And we did this project a few years ago now. It's a public outreach video campaign. We produced 4 short videos to address 4 different topic areas. The first was sort of meant to be a public service announcement about marine protected areas. I don't know if, probably Hollis has shared these videos with you at some point, or they're very easily accessed on the Sonoma Marine Protected Areas Collaborative. I didn't want to take the time to show them all here, but they're really nice videos. We're really proud of this work. We engaged with an excellent documentary film group who produced these for us, so they came out really nice. So the first is the public service announcement of why we need protected areas. And then we made one for exploring tide pools. This one was targeted mainly to kids and school groups and families that want to come out to the coast. So it has a bit about how you should, what's appropriate behavior when you're looking at tide pools and tide pool organisms, and then also some safety issues in that video. And that's one that we can send out to classes if they're having a field trip out at the coast, or it's also just for family safety when they're out at the coast. The third we did was the Kashaya-Pomo tribal traditions video, and that is focused on the newly established Kashaya Coastal Reserve on the coast. And that actually is a really nice video that was one of the selections for the 18th annual Wild and Scenic Film Festival, which we were pretty excited about. And then, the making of that video was really special because it allowed us to really engage more with the Kashaya-Pomo, and they've been active in our collaborative before and after that video was made. So it really helped to expand our relationship with them. And then the fourth video is about the fishing industry that we have along the Sonoma County coast and the things that they're facing in light of not just with the changes that are caused by a lot of the oceanographic and larger climate change issues, and then also the how the establishment of the MPAs have affected them. And that's another video that we're very proud of, and that features Dick Ogg and his fishing activities off his boat. So those are all available on the collaborative website, and if you haven't seen them all already, it's worth it to go. It doesn't take very long to watch them, and they're really nice. So the current project that we're working on, and Hollis could maybe jump in and speak to this a little bit more because she's been working pretty actively on this. Because we've had such an increase in visitorship to the coastal areas during the pandemic, and it's maybe slowed down a tiny bit, but we're still seeing a lot of visitation to the coastal areas. We are piloting the idea of using one of these programmable traffic signs that we can move around to different locations, and we can have messaging on there that relates to issues that we may be seeing along the coast. For example, some of the wording that we've talked about using, I put on the right here, marine protected area, so that people know they're entering a marine protected area when they're driving by, respect wildlife, stay back, and also learn at wildlife.ca.gov. And those are, depending on where the signs are, different messaging will be used. And that's actually, the pilot of that is going to be done in combination with beach watch surveys, so that we can actually start tracking and evaluating whether or not these signs are having an effect on our visitors' behavior when they're at the coast. One of the other things that the collaborative network made available to all of the collaboratives, each collaborative was able to acquire 2 Trident ROVs. These are pretty cool little gadgets that they are on a tether, but you put them in the water in the coastal areas, and off they go. You pilot them. It's almost like a video game. You pilot them from an iPad or another device, and they take video, and you can see what's going on under the water. So these have the Sonoma Collaborative has 2 of these available to be checked out by folks who have a good use for them. And if you want to see some of the video from that, you can go to our Sonoma MPA Collaborative website. Song Hunter was actually using this quite a bit, and has some nice video footage there. So from some of our, I think from the Jenner area and some other areas. So that's worth taking a look at. So if anybody has a use for getting some underwater footage, this is a pretty cool thing. Obviously, it doesn't work in really high energy environments. Like you couldn't put this off the head, off of Bodega Head in the wave area, but in the harbor areas and in the quieter water areas. So that's about the collaboratives and the collaborative network. I'm about to shift gears now to talk about the Bodega Marine Reserve and Bodega Marine Laboratory. Did anybody want to talk about any questions before we go on?
I just wanted to mention that Suzanne talked about the 4 videos, and the one on tide pools was done during 2 of our field trips in 2016. So for those of you that are new tide pool docents, you can watch those and get a sense of the fun rather than just photographs. I'm sorry, am I still buzzy, my voice? Yeah. Okay, and also I put the links that Suzanne mentioned in the chat so that you can copy and paste them directly. And Suzanne, since I'm buzzy, could you talk about what the Golden Gate Collaborative did on the training modules that are now on site? I also posted a link to those.
I don't have much to say about that, Hollis. You probably have been dug into those a little bit more than me, so I'm not sure I would be the best person to speak to those.
Okay, well, I put a link in the chat for those 2, and maybe I'll send something out written where you're not dealing with a buzzy voice.
Okay, any other questions before I dig into the next section? Okay. So I like to use this slide because often we get folks who are so curious about what goes on the reserve and at the laboratory. And of course, we've come through a long pandemic now where the lab has not been able to offer the public tours for over two years. So a lot of people are very curious about what goes on out there. And a lot of people sometimes have interesting ideas about what that might be. You know, there might be some secret experiments going on out there, or people using it as their private surf spot or party spot or picnicking spot. So I'd like to show more of what really happens out there. It's really more of a lot of people staring at things and taking data on things. So not nearly as exciting as it might seem. So I always like to start out when I talk about Bodega Marine Reserve with a little bit of geographic context. So here we are out on the coast in this nice spot. It's like a bump above the bigger bump of Point Reyes. And we're about 2 hours from the University of California at Davis. And of course, north of the San Francisco Bay. And sometimes people wonder, you know, what is a landlocked institution like UC Davis doing with a marine lab on the coast? But UC Davis has actually built up quite an interesting coastal marine sciences institute with a lot of people doing coastal research and ocean research. So it makes a lot of sense if you look into the programs that UC Davis has. So if we zero in on that little bump, which is Bodega Head, here's a nice overview showing the boundaries, the borders of Bodega Marine Reserve. And of course, we're bordered on both sides by California State Park to the north and to the south. There are, the laboratory is set right by the iconic Horseshoe Cove here. And there are some areas, some of this land is actually owned by the UC regions. Some of it is managed by us through different things. We have an MOU with state parks to manage this older North Dune area. That's a very beautiful native dominated relic dune there's a lot of research that goes on there and also some stewardship activities that we do there. We also have a lease with Sonoma County for the tidelands out here. And I don't know if you've ever wandered out there on, this is what we call Gaffney Point. If you've ever wandered out there and seen the no trespassing signs and the no clamming signs, we do cordon off about 1/3 of this area for research only purposes. So all in all, we manage about 640 acres out here on Bodega Head, and that includes this area offshore, which is part of the Bodega Marine Life Refuge. And that's been in existence since the 1960s. And the other nice thing that this overview helps us to look at, and of course, a lot of you are already familiar with this, is there's a lot of different types of habitats out here on Bodega Head. From the wet to the dry areas, there's a whole different, a lot of diversity of habitats and a lot of different areas that draw different types of researchers to use these areas. So I'm going to show some photos of those in a few slides. And our mission at Bodega Marine Reserve is to contribute to the understanding and the wise stewardship of the earth and its natural systems by supporting university level teaching, research, and public service at this protected area. And Bodega Marine Reserve, you may not know this, it's part of a larger network of natural reserve sites across the state of California. The UC system has 41 reserves currently, and the system is still growing. The system protects over 750,000 acres of California's habitats and ecosystems for that mission of research, teaching, and public service. So we are continuing to add sites to this. We've just added through the National Park partnership that we have, we've added a site up in Lassen and also a site down in Point Reyes recently. So we're still growing. And the idea was that the system was going to encompass all of California's diversity of habitats and ecosystems and protect portions of those specifically for research and education. And that's obviously a little bit of a different designation from like a state park or a county park or national park, in that we really provide for the research to occur. You can see that there's a handful of other coastal sites and many other sites going from the Eastern Sierra to the coast and all the way from Lassen down to the border with Mexico. And the Natural Reserve System is the largest university-run system of reserves in the world. So that's something that the UC is really proud of. These reserves are meant to be high-quality habitats for the research, teaching, and outreach. They are protected from development. They provide secure sites for research. And more, of course, research involves expensive instruments in addition to just the access to the habitats and organisms. So that security is really becoming an important part of being able to do research in these areas. They're also hubs of knowledge where a lot of research happens and a lot of knowledge accumulates. And they're also places where different researchers and students from very different disciplines can come together. And they are working in sort of smaller settings than a large campus situation. And they end up collaborating and sparking interesting discussions and thinking of their research in different ways from being exposed in a smaller setting to other disciplines. So it's often a place where a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration happens and is born. And they're also actively managed areas where stewardship practices are developed and improved. So we do a lot of this on Bodega Marine Reserve because we have some special habitats that we're really trying to protect. Really importantly is that these sites are so much more interesting, engaging, and high impact than traditional classrooms. Students of all ages can come out and experience things hands-on and in person and out where all of their senses are firing. And that really makes a much more impactful and educational experience. At Bodega Marine Reserve, some of the highlights that we have is that we have very long-term meteorological, weather, oceanographic, water quality, and population data sets that the lab has been open since 1965. So it's over 50 years now of data that's accumulated. We do annual photo monitoring. We have GIS data, extensive natural history collections, including terrestrial plant herbaria and an herbarium and also an algal herbarium. We have a lot of folks on site that have natural history knowledge of the area. And of course, we provide this outdoor living classroom for the hands-on learning of the students that come from Davis and from many other institutions and some worldwide students. It's this wonderful outdoor living classroom for the hands-on learning. And again, that security element, we provide a safe place where access is restricted such that the instruments and the other field experiments that are occurring won't get trampled either by accident or even poaching or intentional vandalism that can occur in more open places. And I already mentioned that, I think these places actually become more and more valuable over time, because when you have that much knowledge that accumulates in a place, then being able to track that and look back, we can look back now to student reports that happened from the 1960s and early 70s, and people are doing comparisons going to that data and looking at how the climate change is affecting some of these things. So the accumulation of the knowledge really becomes more and more valuable at these places over time. I think it's worth noting that the location of Bodega Marine Reserve and Laboratory on Bodega Head is really the founders of that site really had a lot of foresight, and that they put it in a place that's accessible location to a lot of different habitats in Northern California. It's within an upwelling zone, so it's an incredibly productive ecosystem that we're in. The fact that we can do experimental manipulations on this land is very important, because of course there's so much other protected area around us that doesn't allow for that. It provides for other things. And the fact that we have this amazing field site adjacent to world-class laboratory facilities really facilitates a lot of research and teaching that can happen there. And it's a site that really attracts a diverse community of researchers from not just all over the US, but beyond. I like to show this view of Bodega Head because it helps to highlight, again, the diversity of habitats that are out there. So we have the headland, and we have the San Andreas Fault Zone that comes right in between the North American Plate and Pacific Plate, and the fact that we have different soils, we have different plant systems from one side of the harbor to the other. You have all of the different you have the exposed and protected beaches. We have the long Doran Beach spit. We have the Tombola, that's the dune system that's out there, and all of the different interesting habitats within the harbor, the mudflats and the eelgrass. And it's just a really cool way to kind of think about those things. And it's interesting that we know that the Pacific Plate is still moving northwestward in comparison to the North American Plate, because we have an instrument actually located on the reserve up on the hill towards the state parks portion of Bodega Head. That's a plate boundary observatory. And so that device tracks the movement of the plate in relation to the North American Plate. So there's actually still quite a lot of movement happening out there. So these photos are just meant to give you a nice overview of all of the different habitats that we offer on the reserve. The Rocky Intertidal Zone has become a really important part of the reserve that draws a lot of different research. We have research trends sort of come and go a lot of times. Something will become really hot in the scientific world, and then something else will come along and replace that. So early on, there was a lot of marine research, and then it sort of went more heavily into terrestrial research, and we're seeing a big resurgence again back into marine research at the reserve. So the Rocky Intertidal Zone certainly is a habitat that attracts a lot of researchers and students to the reserve. We also have the exposed and protected beaches. We have the extensive dune system, of course, that also state parks also features. We have a freshwater wetland on site. And we also have a brackish water marsh. We have the coastal prairie and bluff. And we do a lot of stewardship of our coastal prairie areas and bluff areas, because this is a habitat that California has lost a lot of due to development and invasion of non-native species and other things. So the portion that we have on the reserve, we really do a lot to make sure we're protecting that. Then also in the harbor areas, we have the mudflats and the eelgrass meadows. And again, eelgrass research is very, we're having a lot of people doing eelgrass research these days. So you probably have noticed, if you've been out around in the harbor in Bodega Bay, you've probably noticed sometimes weird sticks or what look like net, mesh boxes or other things sticking out at low tide. And that's a lot of the eelgrass researchers that are active out there. And of course, off of Bodega Head, we have the waters are heavily protected around the reserve and a lot of Bodega Head. So the orange portion here is the Bodega Marine Life Refuge. That was put into effect in the mid-1960s. And that basically it extends from the UC region's property boundaries out there out 1,000 feet into the ocean, and that they, the folks who were managing the lab and reserve early on thought that it would be a good idea to protect that immediate shoreline so that it wasn't going to be overfished and overharvested, so that it would have natural populations to be able to be studied. And so that went into effect shortly after the lab was established there, which was a great protection. They layered on fish protections after that to protect the fish populations there too. And then, of course, when the marine protected areas were instituted, the Bodega Head State Marine Reserve, which is in the blue there, which is a full no-take reserve, expanded both north and south of the pre-existing BM Bodega Marine Life Refuge, and goes out 3 nautical miles. And then that's adjacent to the Bodega Head State Marine Conservation Area. So we do, because we're sort of eyes on the water out there, we face into particularly the Bodega Head State Marine Reserve. We are able to watch for poachers out there, and we occasionally do call them in. So we do provide a lot of enforcement assistance out there for that no-take marine reserve. And you guys are probably familiar with this concept, but not just Bodega Marine Reserve, but really our northern to north central coastal California it lies within one of only 4 coastal upwelling zones in the world. And these are really important because they only cover about 1% of the ocean surface, but they deliver 20% of the world's fish catch. These are very highly productive areas because these are where, because of the turning of the earth on its axis and the predominant direction of the winds, particularly during spring and summer, we get this effect that happens where the winds blow and it tends to push the surface waters offshore, and that allows this really deep nutrient-rich water to come up to the surface in the photic zone where the sun reaches through, fuels the phytoplankton growth, and then that fuels the entire food web from there. So these are very productive zones. And because we're in this upwelling zone, a lot of the research that happens at the reserve and the laboratory has to do with looking at those currents and those processes involved in upwelling, and then the effects of those oceanographic processes. So we have a number of instruments on the reserve. We have instruments on the boat, the RV Muscle Point there, and some of the other boats that go out regularly from the lab. And they're constantly taking data about what's happening in the water column, where the direction of the currents are doing. And all of these things are not just interesting from an oceanographic point of view, but also if you are studying organisms, so many of the marine organisms have planktonic, either, they're sending their gametes out into the water to reproduce, or they're sending their larvae out into the water, and they are going out on those currents and being moved around often by those currents. So the oceanographic data really helps to understand some of the population things that are going on with a lot of our marine organisms. So this is I've sort of zoomed in on a portion of the reserve, and you can see all of these represent different instruments that are on the reserve. So in addition to some of the instruments that we run ourselves, we also host a number of instruments for the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. We have a climate reference network out almost on the tip of Muscle Point. We have a long-range high-frequency radar station, which is related. Well, that's the CODAR system that's tracking the sea surface currents. We also host a wind profiler, which is something that NOAA uses to help predict our big rain events that we often get, those southern storms that are the atmospheric river storms. We also have a number of meteorological stations and things that take a lot of the oceanographic data. And a lot of that data is available. If you're not familiar, we do have a webcam that takes a picture of the cove, that horseshoe cove, and you can see, if you're maybe if you're inland and we want to know what the coastal conditions are, you can take a peek at our webcam and know if it's completely fogged in or if it's clear out there. I use that a lot to before I drive out to the coast. There's also weather data there. You can get the air temperature, wind speed, etc. A lot of people use this for recreating in the area. Of course, we get a lot of use by surfers and fishermen using this data. I also wanted to mention that although we do have restricted access because of all of these research projects that we have going on the reserve, there is a public access trail that crosses the reserve, and it is meant to connect the state parks trails on either side of us. So you can go from Bodega Head, from the top of the overlook, and you can hike down the trail and cross over the reserve on this red trail that I've marked here. And this is sort of an approximation on this aerial view. But it crosses over the lab driveway and goes out through the dune system and out and connects to trails on the other side of state parks. So you can go all the way from Bodega Head, the overlook in Bodega Head, out to Salmon Creek Beach. And I also wanted to give a shout out to my staff that I work with. We do a lot of stewardship activities on the reserve. We're trying to keep these particularly the terrestrial habitats, in really good quality shape. So he does a lot of weed management and other resource management out on the reserve. That's Luis Morales. He also has a great volunteer program that he does. He gets people out to help us do a lot of that land management. He is very knowledgeable about the plants and the dynamics and a lot of weed management efforts in our area. And then a lot of you already may know Jackie Sones. She's our research coordinator. She's been at the reserve a long time and has an excellent natural history knowledge of Bodega Head and really a lot of Northern California. She has a wonderful blog that people really love. She's an excellent photographer, and she provides a lot of really beautiful photos of the nature around Bodega Head, and then a lot of the interpretive information that goes along with that. So if you haven't stumbled upon her blog yet, I encourage you to take a look at it and sign up for her regular email messages, because they're a very enjoyable way to learn more about the organisms and the habitats that are out in our area. And of course, I've talked a lot about the reserve because that's sort of my area of expertise and through my position with the reserve. But you can't talk about our site without also talking about Bodega Marine Laboratory. So the laboratory is located within the reserve. And of course, the reserve and the laboratory are very tightly partnered in providing this research, education, and public service facility. The laboratory has a lot of interesting state-of-the-art features. We have a flow-through seawater system that brings seawater into the lab areas so that people can do their research inside with organisms. It has a climate change experimental facility now that has really specific computer control over things like carbon dioxide, salinity, water temp, air temp, all sorts of things. It also has an imaging facility. Of course, a lot of things are very small, so it has lots of interesting instruments so that those things can be studied and used for education and other interpretive things. We also have an anadromous and pelagic fish facility and a pathogen isolation facility. And we also have California Department of Fish and Wildlife folks who are studying some of the marine organism diseases on site. Again, I know it's been a long couple of pandemic years, but normally we have Fridays from 2 to 4. In normal times, Fridays from 2 to 4, it's open for people to come and tour inside the labs, getting a docent-led tour. So hopefully we'll be able to offer those again later in the year, this year, but those are really nice to take advantage of if you haven't done one of those already. The lab has we have a lot of different researchers that come through with a lot of different topics. And of course, we have faculty located who are based, UC Davis faculty who are based at the laboratory, who also teach a lot of classes there for undergraduates and graduate students. and it's across a lot of different topics. So traditionally we've had a lot of ecology and evolution research happening there, coastal oceanography, ocean health, including toxicology and reproductive things, physiology, conservation, and of course, climate change. We are also starting to see, and we're working hard to broaden this even further to include some of the social sciences and the arts and humanities. So we're always looking to expand and bring more people together in our space so that some of those really interesting interdisciplinary collaborations can happen. And I think it's always nice to point out that, the Bodega Marine Laboratory opened in 1965, but University of California researchers and classes have been coming up to the Bodega Bay area to study the marine environment for a long time, well before there was a laboratory there. So here's a picture of a space that they used to use in the harbor. And this is if you're up on the shore at the firehouse looking down into the harbor. This is the location of this little sort of shed or building that was there. That was, they called it the Foggy Bottom Lab. And here's what it looked like inside. It's much, much, much more rustic than what we have today at Bodega Marine Laboratory, but it didn't have much. But this is how interested people were in coming up and studying these areas. This is the location that they would come to and do their lab work in, and then of course explore a lot of the natural areas around Bodega Bay. So there's a long, rich history of research and education that's happened in this area. And of course, the class use of the reserve and laboratory is going strong. We're seeing, of course, during the pandemic, things were slow, but now we're seeing things rebounding very quickly. And we have a lot of classes that come to take advantage of the reserve and the laboratory facilities. We also have classes that are taught on site. So University of California, Davis classes where students will come out and stay for 6 to 10 weeks and live on site and take classes. And of course, these are smaller classes where they get way more mentorship and attention from faculty members, and they spend lots of hours in the field, and they really learn how to do science by getting their hands dirty and making their own observations and designing their own research questions. So there's really high impact classes that are often life-changing for these students. We do have a housing facility on site, and this is in a separate location from the laboratory building. This is the buildings that you can see that are down on the harbor level. We have a couple of dorm buildings. We also have a graduate student dorm and facilities for visiting researchers and even sometimes their families. And of course, we also do a lot of public outreach and education. Today's talk is one example of that, but there's so many other types of outreach that we do. During normal times, again, we would usually have an open house every couple of years. We offer those Friday tours from 2 to 4 for the public. Anybody can just walk in and get a tour between those hours. And we have this wonderful tide touch tank out front of the lab where people can come and explore some of these tidal organisms, and lots of other events and outreach opportunities that we do. So I think I've talked for a long time, so I'm going to wrap it up there, and I am going to stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions. So thank you for your time and attention.
Well, I'll go first with the questions because I have a few. In one of the aerial shots, it looked like, do they dredge the bay to get, to make access for the boats?
The harbor.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how does that affect the mud flats out there?
Yes, they do dredge the harbor. And that is, that it would fill in. It wouldn't be possible to have that commercial fishing fleet there if there weren't the dredging to keep that channel open. I think I'm not an expert on dredging effects. I know that there are better ways to do it, and I know that they spend a lot of time thinking about which method they're going to use. And I think that there's some fine sediments out there, and they may have some effects. Through the last round of dredging, we did not observe any massive changes in the eelgrass beds that are out there, the eelgrass meadows. So that's a good thing. I know that they do also monitor that carefully when they're doing the dredging.
Okay. You also referred to a freshwater marsh on the head. Are you referring to the hole in the head, or is it some other location?
No, a different location. Yeah.
Where is that?
So there, it's up near the laboratory. So
Okay.
it's, yeah.
So what's the composition of the water in the hole in the head? And is it just accumulated rainwater, or is it, brackish water from the cove, or what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if that, I don't know the answer. I've heard that there are fish in there. I don't know if Hollis or Justin's on here today, but I don't know. Hollis, do you have any idea about the hole in the head?
It seems to me that I heard at one point that it may be an underground spring, but I don't know for sure. They're not just fish, but if you stand by the walkway and you look around, it's a hiding place for black-crowned night herons. And you can almost play Where's Waldo? They breed in there, they nest in there, but it's kind of fun to, canvas the entire perimeter of the pond. I once counted 16 of them.
Wow.
And that's a record number.
Wow.
So they do eat fish.
Yeah.
And I assume that it might be a dining area for them as well.
This is Norma. Everybody understands that the hole in the head is associated with the planned nuclear power plant at Bodega Head. And that prior to that hole being dug by PG&E, when there was the plan going forward to build a nuclear power plant out there, that fresh water, if you will, was not there. Although if you go out there, there used to be an interpretive sign that talked about the Native American use of that area because of the fresh water.
Norma, that sign is still there.
Yeah, well, the freshwater availability that the Native Americans used when they used the site before, as I said, the hole was dug for the nuclear reactor.
We owe such a great debt to Bill Cordham and others who fought that fight in the 60s to stop the nuclear reactor. And I've always been acutely aware of it. But Suzanne, after your presentation today, listing all the different ecosystems that are involved within that relatively small area of your reserve, just brought to mind just how fortunate we are for those citizen activists that fought to save those resources for us. It's an amazing landscape of so many different habitats and ecosystems that are on your reserve. And though I knew it from walking it, seeing them listed just kind of blew my mind today.
This is Norma again. Gaffney Point is named after Rose Gaffney, whose property was out there before, there was a Bodega Marine Lab. She owned the ranch and she used to have her little rifle out trying to keep people away. And there wasn't a road that went out there. So, there's a lot of rich history about Bodega Head. You can find it on the historical.
That's a great point, Norma. I'm glad you brought that up because it reminds me that I wanted to give a plug for Jackie Sones, who I showed a picture of. She works with me on the reserve. She's planning to give a historical talk, I think, for a steward's. It was a steward-sponsored talk in another couple of months about the history of Bodega Head. So she has really dug into some of the history in the area based on a lot of the old documents that we have at the lab, and then also other resources that she has dug into. So she always gives a very interesting talk. I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for that because that's a really nice.
Well, I would also, mention just going to the the Rancho Bodega Historical Society site, because they put out a monthly newsletter, and they have a rich trove of historical documents. And in some of those previous newsletters, there were a lot of articles about the history of Bodega, the nuclear power plant. And other, not just the nuclear power plant, not just to focus on that, but, Gaffney Point, Rose Gaffney,
When we're talking about the history of Bodega Head, and you refer to Rancho Bodega, when was that established? Was that a Mexican land grant, a U.S. land grant?
Well, you'd have to go on Hollis put up the historic.
I just put a link to the Historical Society here.
Right.
Okay, I'll check that out. Thank you.
And I've also put in the chat links to everything that Suzanne mentioned during her talk as well.
Suzanne, did you say that the Bodega Marine Lab Friday tours are open again or not yet?
Not yet. We're hoping later in the year, but we're still slowly getting back up to speed for researchers and classes at this point. So I'm sure there will be a big announcement when that's available, but I don't anticipate that before summer at this stage.
Thank you.
Hollis put up the virtual tour link.
Oh, great.
And do you have any volunteer opportunities at either the lab or on the reserve, Suzanne?
We certainly do. I can speak most clearly about the reserve. We have a lot of volunteers that do work we have a coastal prairie demonstration garden out front of the lab that we're working on, and we have a greenhouse plant propagation projects going on, and then we have a lot of other weed management, a whole range of different levels of field work involved with the weed management stuff. And then there's also other groups located at the lab. The Animal Resources Group does a lot of our aquarium display. They take care of the animals, they take care of the displays and other things. So, and then sometimes researchers are looking for help in the field or in the laboratories. So if anybody's interested, they can contact me and let me know what they're interested in particularly, and I can forward them on to the best contact for that.
So Suzanne, can I put your email address in the chat?
Sure.
Okay.
Suzanne, it's Heather. I had a question for you.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research, your own research?
So right now my position is more of an administrative position. So I don't have any active research projects going on for my own research agenda, but for my dissertation, I was looking at macroalgal blooms in the eelgrass community and how they affect not just the eelgrass, but a lot of the organisms that use the eelgrass. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of a feedback. I don't know if that's my mic or not, so I hope that's not too annoying. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's called sea lettuce. It's the green, it looks just like lettuce, but it's an algae that occurs in the harbor. And at different times, it can be really abundant and cover over a lot of the mud flats. And sometimes you can hardly find any of it at all. But I did a long-term 3-year study looking at how that population changes and how it affects the growth of the eelgrass, the survivability of the eelgrass, and then what organisms are living in and among all of that when it blooms really heavily. So I don't know if people remember back to 2005 in the harbor, there were these large things that kind of looked like oyster racks out closer to the yacht club area in the middle of the harbor. Those were my dissertation mesocosms that I had out there. So they were out for a few years, and I upset a lot of people by putting them out there because a lot of the windsurfers like to use that area. But I basically got my PhD dissertation out of that field experiment. So We do others.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've got feedback again. Some of the other projects that we have on the reserve for weed management, we do adaptive management. So we're kind of looking at the effects of different types of treatments for weed management. So we have a little bit of research projects going on with that, but it's nothing really extensive. Any other questions for me?
I put Suzanne's email in the chat. So if you're like me and questions come up afterwards, she's very generous with her time and her knowledge, as you could see today. And thank you so much for joining us today, Suzanne. I learned a whole lot. And, you know, I've been paying attention to what's been going on out there for 30 years. So this is really, really informative for me. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for having me.